many books does it take to keep a camera level? We're gonna see if we can find out today. Was the last video too depressing for you? Too much emphasis on the problem of evil and the person of Satan? Well, don't worry, because today we're tackling a much lighter topic. We're gonna talk about demons instead. When we think of demons today, most of us think of the minions of Satan, sometimes equating them with the fallen angels that abandoned God with Satan's primordial rebellion. But as we saw in the last video, the idea of Satan and his rebellion evolved over time, and so did the idea of demons. So today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the lore of demons. Welcome back to the Plague of Frogs. Like I said a second ago, a lot of us know a story about the origin of demons that goes something like this. Once upon a time, Satan was the highest angel of God until he decided to mount a cosmic rebellion against God. Along with Satan, numerous angels followed the Prince of Darkness in his war against God in an attempt to take the throne. After the failure of this rebellion, they were all cast down to earth, where Satan became the devil and his fallen angels became demons. But the story, as I just described it to you, actually doesn't show up in the Bible itself. It's something that we piece together along the way. So what is the origin of demons? What are they? And how should we think about them today? That's what we're talking about. The plan for this video is a lot like the plan for the last one. We're going to start by taking a look at demons in their ancient Near Eastern context before moving on to talk about demons in the Old Testament of the Bible itself. Following that, we're going to move on to how demons were seen in early Christianity and then wrap up with some concluding thoughts. Well, the concept of demons in the ancient world was pretty much universal. Just about everybody had a belief in obnoxious spirits. The word demon itself is a Greek term relating to a specific class of spiritual beings. We'll talk more about that later, but suffice it to say that we're going to be using the term demon to refer to these obnoxious spirits that show up in a lot of ancient cultures, but there isn't exactly one catch-all term in antiquity for what we call demons today. Depending on the culture, they had a lot of different terms, including different classes of demons, different types of demons, demons that had different weaknesses and strengths that came out during different times of year and attacked certain kinds of people, and so on and so forth. Judaism doesn't seem to reflect a whole lot of complexity in its demonology until a very late stage. Go back and watch my video on the demonology of Solomon if you want more information on that. But there are a couple references in the Bible that deserve our attention. Nevertheless, in the cultures that surrounded the ancient Israelites, like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Phoenicians, we see a complex layering of different spiritual beings in the spiritual realm itself. So we're going to use the term demon to refer to these obnoxious beings in this video, but keep in mind that the word demon is a little bit of an oversimplification in most ancient cultures. When describing the spiritual world of ancient Mesopotamia, which was the major force in most of the ancient Near East, John Walton divides ancient spirits into three different classes. Class 1 spirits are the gods. These are the spirits that carry out the functions of the universe, like the orbit of the sun, the passage of the stars, the water cycle, and so on and so forth. Class 3 spirits, on the other hand, are spirits that used to be humans. These are the departed dead, the venerated ancestors, and the ghosts of dead kings. In between these, the human-originated Class 3 spirits, which are essentially ghosts, and the Class 1 spirits, which are essentially the functions of the cosmos and the personalities behind them, are Class 2 demons. And this corresponds most closely to what we understand as demons. These Class 2 spirits in most ancient demonologies don't really have a grand origin story of rebellion against the gods or anything else of that nature. They're just kind of there. In fact, in some considerations, they're seen as sort of the after effects or the accidental results of movements in the spiritual world. They don't really have a purpose or function that they serve. They just kind of accidentally popped into existence and are sort of wandering around without a cause at this point. These Class 2 spirits that didn't really have a purpose weren't exclusively hostile to people, but they were known for harassing anybody that they came across. And whenever a Class 2 spirit or a demon came across a person, usually it was required to invoke a Class 1 spirit, one of the gods, in order to cleanse that person of the demonic interference. It seems that the ancient gods weren't particularly attentive to the movements of Class 2 spirits, since they didn't really carry out a function on Earth. But if a human worshiper of that god were to call that deity's attention to plague or problem being caused by a Class 2 spirit, then the deity would remove the offending spirit if they deigned the ability to do so. And this led to a very complicated and vast exorcistic literature in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and Hittite references, Ugaritic references, and so on. It seems that the ancients had a sort of scientific approach to which certain spirits could afflict people and which deities they needed to invoke in order to repel them. But Class 2 spirits weren't exclusively hostile, and a great example of this is the Pazuzu demon. If you haven't heard the name Pazuzu before, you're probably still familiar with this demon because in the movie The Exorcist, it's a statue of Pazuzu that appears at one point, suggesting that the demon afflicting the afflicted girl in the movie is actually Pazuzu himself. This is really ironic because in ancient Mesopotamian magic, Pazuzu actually had a very important positive role to play in that system. You see, there was an ancient demon known as the Lamashtu. And Lamashtu was known as the cradle snatcher because anytime an infant died spontaneously, whether it was from sudden infant death syndrome or some other underlying cause that ancient medicine wasn't able to recognize, the ancients blamed the sudden death of that infant on the Lamashtu spirit. So this is an angry feminine spirit which is coming and snatching away the soul of the unborn child. But Lamashtu had a weakness, and that was Pazuzu. Pazuzu would be invoked. Although he was a pestilent demon who could bring plague and destruction, nevertheless, Pazuzu was invoked as the defender of these children, basically to ward off the Lamashtu. In fact, here's an example of an engraving from ancient Assyria depicting Pazuzu exorcising Lamashtu from a home. So all that to say, The Exorcist kind of picked literally the worst demon possible to represent as possessing the girl in the movie, because Pazuzu wasn't the afflictor of children, he was in a sense the protector of children in ancient Mesopotamian magic. Now it's asking a lot for a movie, especially in that time, to do that amount of research on this, but nevertheless I thought it was kind of ironic. But invoking one spirit to drive off another, whether it be a class 1 spirit like the gods or another class 2 spirit which had a rivalry with the offending demon, was also pretty common in ancient Egyptian and Greek exorcistic texts as well. In fact, this might be the reason why when Jesus is casting out demons, the religious authorities claim that he's casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, which was a large demon known from that time and may be a cognate name for Satan. We actually have an ancient Hebrew exorcistic manual, which is found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, that actually invokes Beelzebul to chase out another lesser demon, invoking Beelzebul by the power of God to chase out a lesser demon. So God is still the ultimate actor on the scene here, but it's invoking God to invoke Beelzebul to chase out another demon. So not only is this an example of the fact that demons were used to chase out other demons, but it also gives a background for why certain Jewish religious leaders who didn't want to recognize Jesus' role as the Messiah were saying, well, he's not doing this by God directly, he's doing this by alternative means, while still recognizing the fact that nevertheless, the demons were exorcised. Don't worry, we'll talk about Jesus' exorcisms later, but for the time being, it's important to note that sometimes you could chase out one demon by invoking another demon in the ancient world. Of course, if you do that, you risk inviting the second demon, which may be a bigger fish, into the picture. So it wasn't without its risks. It also shouldn't be assumed that the ancients attributed every single instance of pestilence, disease, and war to class 2 spirits that are causing trouble. In fact, in Mesopotamia, the war god and plague god Nergal was worshipped along with the rest of the pantheon. Nergal was seen as one of the primary actors whenever war or plague broke out, and he was seen as the husband of Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. So even though Nergal was ultimately seen as responsible for a lot of problems that the ancients encountered on a daily basis, nevertheless, he was seen as one of the gods who received worship and who even had temples built for him. So as we've seen, a lot of ancient cultures had really complicated demonologies, different layouts of what types of demons did what and how to remove them by invoking this or that god or by using this or that sacrifice. But when we turn from these ancient cultures to ancient Israelite culture in the Iron Age onwards, we're actually really disappointed because there's a lack of advanced demonology within any of the Old Testament texts that the Israelites wrote. This isn't to say that the Israelites necessarily disbelieved in demons, but what is interesting is that the demons didn't seem to play substantial enough of a role to find their way into Israelite literature almost entirely. There are a couple places where the language of demons is used, but it doesn't seem to refer to literal demons here. In the Cain video, I mentioned the fact that Cain is said to have sin crouching by his door, which may be a reference to the Rabatsu demon of Assyrian lore, but it doesn't seem to suggest that sin is an actual demon waiting for Cain. Likewise, in the Psalms and in the songs of Isaiah, we see language associated with ancient deities of war, plague, and pestilence being used, but whenever they are being used there, these are references to the fact that God, the God of Israel, is capable of bringing pestilence and plague into effect. These are references to demons. They're less independent entities than they are weapons that God can deploy against people who deserve it. There are a couple situations where a so-called bad spirit is invoked to afflict either Saul or the king of Israel specifically, but in both of these cases, the evil spirit is likewise sent from the throne room of God. This is God sending an agent to enact his will. and he needs somebody to work evil for a more evil person. Remember, Saul is sort of the villain of his story by this point, so an evil spirit afflicting him, or a spirit of badness afflicting him, isn't a morally evil agent. If anything, it's something like an anti-hero or something of that nature. The same applies in the Book of Kings when the king of Israel is led astray by an evil spirit from the throne room of God. There's a couple names of later Israelite demons that show up in the Old Testament, like Azazel and Belial, but in the Old Testament texts themselves, it seems that these are abstract concepts. They haven't yet been turned into devils. In later Judaism, they would be seen as demons, but in the earliest texts themselves, they don't seem to be understood as independent spirits just yet. What's also interesting is that when we read the literature of the ancient Israelites, which we find in the Old Testament, we find a variety of different perspectives on the divine realm. Some of these documents assume that the divine realm, which overlaps with the human realm on occasion, is chock full of ancient spirits and angels and what we could call demons as well that are always active and prowling around all the time. In other ancient literature that comes from Israel, however, we see a rather empty spiritual realm, with one particular example that I'll get to in a minute here. So it seems that there wasn't any official theology of demons in ancient Israel that we should inherit today, but there were different perspectives that different writers reflected in these ancient documents. So for instance, the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, are consisted of 4 earlier sources, J, E, D, and P. These 4 sources were written by different writers in different places in Israel and at different times in Israel's history. And all 4 of these sources reflect rather different perspectives on the divine realm itself. The J source and the E source are the 2 earlier documents in the 4 sources of the Pentateuch. And both of these sources seem to refer to a rather well-filled spiritual world. There's a lot of spiritual beings that are moving around. There's spiritual movers and shakers going on in the world itself. But they don't seem to have a dualistic split between good angels on the one side and bad demons on the other side. In fact, we don't even see the figures of demons show up at all. But nevertheless, there are angels moving around. The gods of the ancients are doing various things, all within a monotheistic Israelite framework, but we see spiritual actors on the spiritual stage interacting with the human actors. So in J and E, there's sort of an overlap of the divine and human realm, and we see a lot of that play out in these sources. The D source and the P source, on the other hand, have relatively little to say about angels and demons as well. So for instance, the D source, which is almost entirely restricted to Deuteronomy, which is where it got its name, will actually, it's interesting. So it summarizes events that took place in the earlier books of the Bible, right? So the J source and the E source are the sources of most of the stories in the narrative sections of the Bible itself. When we come to Deuteronomy, what's interesting is it'll actually recapitulate things that have already happened. It's telling you the story again in a summary fashion, kind of like, okay, let's look back there. How did we get to where we are right now? But when it retells the stories, angels are conspicuously absent, even where they are conspicuously present in those stories. So what the D source appears to be doing is scrubbing the angels away from the retelling of the story itself, which is really interesting. The D source is probably doing this to avoid refracting attention to a variety of different spiritual beings, when all of the attention should be paid to the God of Israel specifically. And what makes this relevant and really understandable for the D source itself is the fact that the D source was probably written during a time when polytheism had already been a problem in Israel. The Israelites were worshiping all sorts of other spiritual beings, and the scribes of the D source were part of a movement that were saying like, okay, we got to hone in and focus on the one God who made a covenant with us. That's what Deuteronomy is all about, is the covenant. And so it didn't want to distract people by having references to other spiritual beings in it. Even if they're angels, even if they're things that are on God's side, it doesn't want to distract from total attention on God himself. And a very similar reality is reflected in the P source. The P source, which is usually considered to be the latest of these sources, but increasingly it's being pushed back earlier and earlier in Israel's history. It's complicated, we'll talk about it later. But the point being, the P source is even more aggressive than the D source on this. The spiritual world for the P source is empty, except for God. The only actor in the spiritual realm is God himself. There's no room for angels, no room for demons, no room for spirits. In the priestly theology, God is really the only actor in the spiritual stage. But what's really interesting is that later scribes combined all 4 of these sources together into the Pentateuch, or the Torah that we now know today. My money is on the figure of Ezra being one of the final people to do the finishing touches on putting these books together. But the point being, whoever was responsible for that took documents that had a spiritual worldview that was very well filled out, and documents that had a virtually empty spiritual worldview, and wove them together into a new piece of literature that we still read today, Jews and Christians and everybody in between. And that's really interesting to me, because I think that it suggests that maybe there's some more flexibility in how we should view the spiritual world, rather than a sort of divinely inspired systematic theology of angels and demons. Maybe there's room for JE Christians and DP Christians in the church itself and in other religious communities that are associated here. When we do encounter other spiritual beings in most biblical literature, it's the fact that the other nations have gods of their own. Israel was supposed to only worship its God, Yahweh, but the Israelites don't seem to have denied the existence of gods of the other nations. They suggested that Israelites were only supposed to worship Yahweh, and they even thought that Yahweh was the leader of the divine assembly. In other words, when all the gods got together to, make sure the universe is operating properly, the God of Israel is the one who is running the show there. But they do seem to have acknowledged the existence of other gods in the ancient Near East. They just couldn't worship them. And these weren't abstract figures in the divine realm either. The Israelites knew the names of these deities because other people worshipped them. So, for instance, the Moabite god was Chemosh. The Ammonite god was Milcom, probably. We'll talk about that later. The Edomite god was Cus, and there were many other gods besides these that the ancient peoples around them worshipped. There's a dozen, Canaanite gods, and Egyptian gods, and Hittite gods, and good Lord, Mesopotamian gods. There's a lot of those ones. So the spiritual world was full, and the Israelites knew that. And they may have acknowledged a certain amount of reality to the existence of these beings as the rulers of these other nations around Israel. But again, they placed emphasis on the fact that Israel was dedicated to Yahweh, the God of Israel. They were only to worship the God of Israel. And even if there was reality behind these other deities, they have nothing to do with the nation of Israel itself, which was taken out of Egypt by God and which had a contract of exclusivity with God called the covenant. Quick point I want to make before I move on: just because the Bible and the people who wrote it assume that these deities exist doesn't necessarily mean that modern Christians, Jews, and anybody else has to acknowledge their existence as well. The Bible never asserts the existence of these beings. That's to say, it's never the Bible's mission to say, hey, there's a whole lot of spiritual beings out there that are orchestrating the motions of the cosmos and you should be aware of them. That's never really a part of biblical theology itself. It's an assumption made by the people who wrote the Bible. And Christians today aren't beholden to the assumptions of the people who wrote the Bible, only to the things that the Bible itself explicitly affirms. A great example of this is the fact that a lot of people in the Old Testament period appear to have been under the assumption that the earth was flat and that there were mountains surrounding the earth that held up a solid dome above them, beyond which was the waters of chaos. The Bible never affirms that this is how the world is constructed. Rather, that's just how people understood it back in the day, because that's all they could see. They couldn't tell the earth was round. They didn't have satellites yet. And that's an assumption that they had. God doesn't seem to have been bothered to correct that assumption. It wouldn't have been particularly useful to them if they're talking about covenant and theology and morality, to be like, hey, by the way, I got to update your model of the world. And so as a result, because they had this archaic understanding of how the world was set up, they assume that in their texts. So sometimes in the book of Isaiah, we'll read about the circle of the earth floating upon the waters, which is similar to how people viewed the world in, for instance, Homeric Greece. But that doesn't mean that people today necessarily have to adopt those ideas as well. Because again, these are the assumptions of the people at the time. They're not the thing that the Bible is trying to communicate to you. The Bible's not a scientific textbook. It's a work of theology. It's a work of covenant. These are the things that we're beholden to. We're beholden to the theological aims of the biblical texts and not to the assumptions that the authors made about them. So back to the gods. So the Israelites probably acknowledged the existence of these foreign gods. They were probably things in the spiritual world, and even that they were the employees of God in the divine council. That's to say that they were responsible for governing the nations that they were allotted to. Cus to Edom, Ashur to the Assyrians, Marduk to Babylon, so on and so forth. But the Israelites probably wouldn't have considered these gods demons or, afflicting spirits of that kind. Not only do we never see these deities attempt to possess anybody or cause, abstract little bits of trouble for them, but they're also busy carrying out functions of rule. They're kings in the spiritual realm. You don't really have a whole lot of time to be running around causing mischief. There are a couple places where we may find references to Class 2 spirits, these obnoxious demons, but most of these turn out to be not very good references. So, for instance, in Isaiah 13:21, we have references to what's been traditionally interpreted as goat demons. We find this in Old Latin interpretations, and the phrase in this verse is rendered as daimon in the Greek translation. So when the ancients read this text, a lot of them thought that this was talking about some sort of goat demon. By the way, this line of interpretation is where we get the idea that goat demons are sort of a part of Satan's pantheon of sorts, and so that's how goat demon imagery entered into popular imagination, especially when Greek and Roman Christians a couple centuries later were reading these texts and associated goat demons with fawns and satyrs. But in the original context of this text, it seems that Isaiah is just talking about goats. There doesn't seem to be any explicit reference to a demon going on here. It's sort of puzzling as to why these Septuagint translators looked at this and said, you know what, goat? It's a demon. But nevertheless, that appears to have happened for some reason or another. But in the original version of Isaiah, the Hebrew text with the Hebrew audience, it doesn't seem that they had a sort of evil spirit here in mind. Now, what is interesting is that in Isaiah 34:11, there may be a reference to the Assyrian wind demon Lilitu. Lilitu entered into popular imagination in the transcription of the name as Lilith. Lilith is understood in some, I believe, medieval period texts as being the first wife of Adam and sort of a demonic figure, but we don't see the character of Lilith show up in either Old Testament texts, Second Temple texts, or early Christian texts. In other words, the figure of Lilith in popular imagination is like long time after the Old Testament, and even the New Testament was already like locked up and done, right? But nevertheless, Lilitu was an Assyrian wind demon associated with certain sites in the ancient world. And so in Isaiah 34:11, there may be a reference to the wind demon Lilitu here. We know it was, the demon was known as far west as Arslan Tash, which isn't too far from Israel. So it's not impossible that, even though it's an Assyrian demon, that Isaiah had caught wind of this, the joke. But at the same time, it's sort of unclear as to whether Isaiah is referring to the existence of a demon, or if he's using sort of play on words by using the idea of a wind demon to communicate something to his audience. So there may be a reference to a demon in Isaiah 34:11, but it's far from certain that Isaiah is saying, hey, by the way, there's a demon out there that you need to be aware of. It doesn't seem to be what he's doing here. So to summarize, in the Old Testament period, we really don't see any major or possibly any at all references to demons. There certainly wasn't a developed demonology that found its way into the Bible. Now, the people in the biblical times themselves probably did believe in some sort of, obnoxious spirits behind a lot of the ills in life, falling ill, spontaneous plague, etc., etc. And speaking of demons in this way, or class 2 spirits, gave people a way of dealing with these problems as they came up. But it doesn't seem that there was a systematized way of looking at this that found its way into the Bible. But that would change with what's called the Second Temple period. In the Old Israelite period, the paradigm is the idea that there's a council of divine beings that rule over the world. And the head of this council is the God of Israel, Yahweh. He is the ultimate governor, and all the gods who are operating the nations of the rest of the world are sort of his employees. But during the Second Temple period, people start thinking more and more of these spiritual rulers of the world in darker and more hostile terms, especially as the Israelites themselves encountered repeated and just terrible, terrible situations in life, starting with the Babylonian exile, but moving on to oppression under Greek rule as well. So there was a lot of bad stuff going on in the world during this time period, and that may be one of the reasons why the rulers of foreign nations came to be seen less as sort of these morally neutral employees of God and more as these rulers of the dark world who are out to get you. Part of this move to this sort of dualism may have been facilitated by the introduction of Persian religion to Israel. The Persians did rule over the Israelites for over a century, and they were on pretty good terms with the Israelites compared to the Babylonians on the one hand and the Greeks and Romans on the other hand. Like, those guys, bad, don't like them. Persians were actually pretty chill. So it's entirely possible that Persian dualistic ideas started to seep into Israelite religious thought. And by the way, that would be pretty common in the ancient world. Anytime two cultures come in contact with one another, you see ideas bleed from one to the other without taking all of their baggage with them. In other words, one culture coming into contact with another culture can use the symbolism and the ideas of that culture to express its own ideas elsewhere. Now, there might be some of the ideas of that, donating culture brought along with it, but it's not necessarily like, oh, that's a cool idea, I'm taking this and everything that it contains, and it means that exact same thing in my religion now. Usually what would happen is they'd be like, that's a cool way of expressing that idea. I'm going to deploy it in my own religious context, make modifications to it to fit my own religious purposes, and deploy it this way. So it's possible something like that happened with Jewish religion in this time period, but as I said with the Satan video, the idea of this early Persian Zoroastrian dualism is increasingly suspicious or suspect by scholars. So it's sort of hard to say exactly how much of an influence it would have had, but it is interesting that it was during this time frame, during and shortly after Persian occupation, that the dualism between the rulers of this dark world and the God of Light really start coming out. An example of cultural borrowing that I wanted to bring up, and which you probably saw on my notes here already, is the presence of sarcophagi in Phoenicia. So here's an example of what a sarcophagus of a Phoenician king looked like. And looking at this, if I hadn't told you it was Phoenician, you probably would have assumed this is Egyptian, and pretty good reasons for that. The Egyptians are famous for these things. But the Phoenicians had great trading relationships with the Egyptians around this time period, and so they would have brought with them some of these Egyptian ideas, like making sarcophagi for kings. Now, the Phoenician sarcophagus that I just showed you and many others like it aren't identical with Egyptian sarcophagi. These ones are a little bit different. They have text on the outside, the art style is a little bit different, so it's not a one-to-one borrowing, but they did take an idea from Egypt and adapt it to their own purposes, and something similar might have happened with Jewish religion and Persian religion. So just kind of a concrete, or in this case basalt, example of how this could happen. Speaking of Persians, it is worth noting that there are two big pieces of information that I should mention when we talk about possible Persian influence on Jewish demonology. And the first one is that there is a demon from Persian religion, because they did have a pretty advanced system of demonology that does show up in Jewish literature. Not in the Bible, at least not if you're a Protestant, but in the intertestamental book of Tobit. The chief demon that's causing all the problem there is called Asmodeus in the Greek translation. In Hebrew literature, Asmodeus is known as Ashmedai. You can watch the Demonology of Solomon video if you want to hear all about the duel between Ashmedai and Solomon. But what's interesting is that Asmodeus or Ashmedai probably owes its origin to a Persian demon called the Asmodeva, which was a malevolent spirit in Zoroastrian theology. So this seems to be clearly an example of Jewish borrowing of a Persian demon name, at least, to get a point across. But again, this is coming from a non-canonical book which was written hundreds of years after even the Persian occupation had ended. So take that for whatever it's worth. The other piece of information is that in later Persian rule, the role of various world spirits, which were identified as demons or devas, was critiqued by the Persian ruling authority. In fact, in the inscription of Xerxes I, we find the fact that demons are no longer to be worshipped throughout the entire land occupied by Persia. They were to worship Ahura Mazda, perhaps not exclusively. There were probably still other gods worshipped alongside the Zoroastrian high god, but nevertheless we see the demonization of demons, as it were, under Persian rule. And the demonization of demons applied to everywhere that the Persians ruled, and the Persians at the time were ruling ancient Israel. So it's possible that there was some influence there as well, but again, exactly how that would have impacted the Jewish worldview of that time is still a little bit shaky, but it's still interesting. Now, the Greeks weren't the only people to have a political and cultural influence over Israel as well, because while Persians and the Jewish people typically got along pretty well, the next people in line really didn't, and that would be the Greeks. So around 330 BC, Alexander the Great does his whole great thing and kind of, makes his way across the ancient Near East all the way out to India. And one of the places he stopped at along the way was Jerusalem in ancient Israel. After beating the Persians out of that, Alexander went on his way. He stopped briefly at Jerusalem. But it's really Alexander that we have to worry about, because he died not long after that. He had a short and brief career. It was Alexander's successors that would really have a cultural impact on Judaism of this time. Long story short, because it deserves its own video, when Alexander died, his kingdom was split into 5 smaller kingdoms by his generals, who all said, hey, everything is mine, and they agreed to disagree and then killed each other for hundreds of years. The point being, Israel happens to be right on the borderline between the Seleucid dynasty to the north and the Ptolemaic dynasty to the south. So it was constantly getting tossed back and forth between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies as they were fighting each other. And a lot of bad stuff happened to the Israelites at this time, again deserving its own video with the Maccabean Revolution, but that's kind of the situation at the time. So there was a lot of Greek influence. It was kind of hard to avoid it because Greek influence was cultural in a lot of ways. So for instance, they were building gymnasiums, they were introducing Greek education, Greek health, Greek road systems, things of this nature. They were sort of Hellenizing not just the Israelites, but everyone that they came across. One of the benefits of this is that everybody started to speak Greek in the ancient world, and that means if you're an Egyptian in Egypt and an Indian in Northwest India, and you both speak Greek, you can talk to each other now. That's really cool, and it was really beneficial. but we also start to see the erosion of some local cultures in some ways. So Israel did start to get Hellenized, and a lot of people resisted this. They sought to sort of cling to cultural tradition, which is always what's going to happen when colonization takes place. But even the most conservative people can't help be Hellenized a little bit, at least in this particular instance. So during the Greek period, we start to find more and more ancient Israelite or Jewish texts starting to be written in Greek. Probably the oldest of these, or some of the oldest, is the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, which is commonly called the Septuagint. Fun fact, at the time of this recording, Tommy and I are working on a podcast episode on that. It probably won't be out for a really long time, but if you are interested in the Septuagint, we've got stuff in the pipe for you, so hang on. But this is the point in ancient Israelite literature where we start to see the word demon crop up. Now again, demon is a Greek word, and in common terms, it's sort of a catch-all for evil spirits. But in the ancient world, the Greeks had a little bit of a different meaning for this. The oldest references to demons in Greek literature come from Hesiod. He wrote a little bit after Homer, but is still one of the oldest Greek writers that we know of. Hesiod talks about the generations of humankind coming in different phases. We have the Golden Age with Golden Age humans, the Silver Age with Silver Age humans, and so on and so forth. Hesiod reports, according to one myth, that in the Golden Age, when Golden Age humans died, their spirits lingered on Earth. So essentially, the spirits of Golden Age humans became daimons. And daimons were meant to serve as the intermediaries between the human realm and the divine realm. So originally, daimons or demons were beneficial to humankind. They were sort of messengers between the two realms themselves. And this would be picked up later by philosophers like Plato, who talked about these attendant daimons, or Socrates' demon, if you've heard that before. These are these benevolent attending spirits that are supposed to facilitate contact with the divine realm and with humankind. Not only this, but the Olympians, the high gods of Greece themselves, would sometimes be referred to using the word demon. So it seems that the word demon referred to a broad spiritual class. So all gods were demons, but not all demons were gods. Demons could be referred to, the word demon could be used to refer to a lot of different spiritual beings, but the gods were a special class of being within that sort of scope. And what's interesting with that is that while in the ancient Near East, the high gods themselves were too busy orchestrating the functions of the universe to care about human individuals all that much, the Olympian gods were actually known to act like a demon and possess people from time to time. So for instance, the spirit of Apollo would possess the Pythian oracle and make her spout holy words that the other people at the Oracle of Delphi, for instance, would write down, and these were seen as the oracles of the Pythia. Likewise, Dionysus was believed to be present in the Dionysiac and the Bacchic rituals, where people engaged in a sort of holy madness by getting just blazing drunk on wine as much as they could. And it was believed that Dionysus himself was somehow spiritually present in that madness. Now, all that being said, we can't just take what the word demon meant to the Greeks and assume that when ancient Israelites use the word demon, that that's necessarily what they're referring to. Because as we're going to see, the way that ancient Israelite authors in the Greek period were using the word demon suggests that they had something different in mind than what the classical Greek understanding of demon was. The word demon is used in a lot of ancient Jewish literature that's written in Greek to refer to a lot of different spiritual beings, but every single time it does occur, with a couple exceptions in the more philosophical literature, it always refers to an evil spirit. So again, the idea of evil spirits who are somehow opposed to God's will is what the ancient Israelites meant when they were using the term demon. So a Greek writing in Greece to Greek people might use the term demon to refer to one of the gods. It could be Zeus that he's talking about, or it could be this obnoxious, spiritual force. But when ancient Jewish writers were using this, if not every time, but almost every time, they're almost exclusively referring to hostile forces. The translators of the Old Testament into Greek likewise use the term demon to refer to a lot of different spiritual beings that show up in the biblical texts themselves. God and angels are never referred to as demons, but some of the gods of the nations are on occasion. For instance, the Shedu spirits, or the Shadim, as we find them in Hebrew, that show up in Deuteronomy and some of the Psalms. This word Shadim, which refers to some sort of class of ancient deity, is translated as demon in the Greek translation of that text. I think Dale Martin really hit the nail on the head when he summarized as follows. The translators of the Hebrew Bible, therefore, know these popular assumptions about demons. They take different Hebrew words or concepts that originally referred to several different kinds of beings and interpret them in terms of common Greek ways of imagining demons. They lump several Near Eastern words and beings into the one-size-fits-all category of Greek demons, along the way casting both the words and the beings in a more consistently negative light than may have been assumed by most Greeks. It's worth noting too that most of the time in the Old Testament, when there's references to the gods of other nations, when those passages are translated into Greek, most of the time they're not translated as demons. Sometimes they're translated as idols or something referring to idolatry, which would just be a reference to the fact that the ancients would have worshipped idols of these gods. But on other occasions, when it's talking about the divine counsel of God, the gods that we find there, which are originally the gods of the nations, become angels. They're referred to as angels. And so their role as sort of the spiritual employees of God is kind of preserved and sort of cleansed from any demonic attributes by identifying these rulers of the various nations with God's angels. Again, that's not precisely the role that those beings played in the Old Testament itself. Angel in the Old Testament period meant a messenger. There were other spiritual beings that were talked about that were distinct from angels. Man, we should make a whole video on angels. I wonder if that's coming next. But the gods of the nations aren't referred to as being in this spiritual class. But in the Second Temple period, angels became this sort of catchphrase or catchword for any spiritual being that serves God. And so the deities in charge of the nations were identified as angels, the employees of God, during the Second Temple period itself. So we see already that ancient Jewish writers in the Greek period are innovating. They're sort of taking ideas possibly from Persia and almost definitely from Greece, and they're working them out, they're expanding them. They're taking them into their own culture and kind of giving a Hebrew-Greek hybrid or Hebrew-Persian-Greek hybrid of how the spiritual realm kind of works. And what's really cool about that is one of the results was a narrative about where these demons come from. And like everything in this channel, we're going back to the Book of Enoch for this one. So the Book of Enoch was written in multiple parts. Just to summarize, the oldest of these is the Book of Watchers. This comes from around 250 BC, which is during the Greek period. Remember, Alexander was around 330 BC, so 80 years after that, around then. But the story is much older, may have Babylonian, possibly Persian roots. It's kind of hard to say. But the point being, the Book of Enoch, Book of Watchers, was written around 250 BC, so during the Greek period, drawing on older antecedents. But the cool thing about this is that in this narrative, we have ancient Jewish writers who are trying to come up with this idea of how evil enters into the world. So we have the concept of the Watchers. The story of this part of the Book of Enoch is that there's a class of angel in heaven that are watching humankind. Their function is to provide divine overwatch. And these angels see that human women look pretty good. And so they come down and they marry women and they have children with them. God isn't happy with this because that's not what God designed the angels to do. There's a whole lot of cool stuff going on there that we've talked about elsewhere, and I'll talk more about in the future because it's so cool. But the point being, the Watcher angels are punished, they're locked below the earth, and they're sort of disposed of. But the Watcher angels aren't the only threat. Because remember, they had children, and those children are half angel and half human. And so when those children grow up, they become the giants of old. And this shows up in a lot of Jewish literature around this time. The Enoch books, the Book of Giants, the Book of Jubilees, so on and so forth. So the giants of old are the descendants in this narrative of the Watcher angels and of human women. Well, God decides this isn't a great idea. I never intended for these things to exist, so we're just going to wipe them all out with the flood of Noah. In the Book of Enoch, that's what the flood of Noah does, is it's to reset the world from the evil that the Watchers set upon them. But there's a complication, because once the giants do drown in the flood, their souls are half human and half angel. So the human element is pulling them down to the underworld where humans go, but the spiritual element from their fathers is pulling them up to the spiritual world. So as a result, they get stuck in between. And the realm in between the underworld and the overworld is earth. And so this is the origin of evil spirits. Now, importantly, the giant souls are never called demons in the Book of Enoch itself. They're called evil spirits. So seems to be the fact that ancient Israelite authors assumed that this is the origin of these obnoxious spirits, these things going around causing trouble that we see more in Mesopotamian literature and in Egyptian literature and in Greek literature. But still, we have an idea for where evil spirits come from, even if they weren't called demons yet. I say yet because that changed very quickly. Now, in the Book of Enoch itself, we have three different classes of hostile or suboptimal spiritual beings. We have the Watchers, we have demons, and we have the unclean spirits that come from the giant souls. The Watchers are sort of dealt with. They're imprisoned under the earth. They're not really in the picture anymore. The unclean spirits of the giant offspring are the evil spirits that are harassing humankind. But the demons just sort of exist. Their origins are never really explained. They're just kind of there. And what's interesting is they're distinct from the Watchers and they're distinct from the giant offspring as well, because the souls of the giant offspring convince people to worship demons. We have this idea of, where did idolatry come from being laid out here? It's the evil spirits influencing humankind to worship these other beings, which are called demons. But this threefold distinction between watchers and demons and giant spirits would be sort of merged or mutated about 150 years later. Around 150 BC, another Jewish writer who knew the book of Enoch and who knew the canonical books of the Bible wrote something called the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees is fantastic. It deserves its own video. We talked about it in the last one. But what's interesting here is that the category of demons and the category of giant souls have been fused together. So instead of 3 categories of evil spirits, we have 2. There's the watchers. They're imprisoned under the earth, still out of the picture. But the second category is demons and giant spirits. And in Jubilees, this reworking of the Enoch story, we have the idea that the souls of the giants are actually demons themselves. So we had a shift in perspective from the time that the book of Enoch was written to the time that Jubilees was written. And this is the model that most Judean literature following this point tends to follow. Whether or not it acknowledges the Watcher story as being real, this provides a really good example for where the souls of the spirits that are unclean and causing trouble in the world come from. So it's sort of a convenient way of describing where spirits come from, which is really neat because, again, in Mesopotamia and in other ancient cultures, we don't really have a narrative about that. When the gods were putting the world into order, they just kind of happened. They were sort of this accident of the creative process. But here we actually have a narrative for where the demons come from. And I think that's really cool in its own right. Now, all this was going on during the Second Temple period. And again, the Second Temple period takes place after the Old Israelite period and after the Babylonian exile. I'll do a video on the history of Israel later, but the cool thing is the fact that during the Second Temple period, there seems to have been a proliferation in demonology. Remember, we don't have a whole lot of demonology in the Old Testament period, but we do have a lot of it in the Second Temple period. And one of the great examples of that is we have a lot of different references to exorcistic literature. So, for instance, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus preserves a story about a Jewish exorcist who carries out an exorcism in the name of King Solomon. Again, if you want to know more about the demonology of Solomon, you can go watch the video on this channel about that. But we have other different examples of that too. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, we found several non-canonical psalms. These are songs written in the style of the Psalms of the Old Testament, but that weren't included in the Bible itself. And several of these, which claim to be written by David, or in the spirit of David, Le David is a whole topic in and of itself, are geared towards exorcistic rituals. On top of that, a couple other texts speak about Jewish exorcism. The aforementioned text of trying to exorcise demons using the help of Beelzebul is one example of this. Another one is called the Prayer of Nabonidus, which refers to a anonymous Jewish exorcist in the Persian period. So we see the idea of sort of demonological literature coming into its own in Israelite culture at this time. And it's also in this time period that we arrive at the New Testament itself. If you don't know anything about Jesus, you probably still know the fact that he was known for casting out demons. So Jesus serves in some way in the role of an exorcist. But what did it actually mean when Jesus was exorcising these demons? Because as it turns out, it goes a lot deeper than just getting rid of an obnoxious evil spirit. What's interesting is that the exorcism practices of Jesus in the New Testament are frequently paired up with his healing miracles. So we'll have an instance of a healing miracle and an exorcism, and this happens quite a lot in the New Testament. But scholarship on what demons were in the ancient world suggests that people would have seen the exorcism narratives of Jesus as examples of healing miracles. Because again, demons were usually blamed for pestilences. They were blamed for all sorts of different ills that happened to a person. And so Jesus dealing with those ills would have been perceived in almost the same way as Jesus healing someone with a broken leg or somebody who suffered from blindness. So the idea is that Jesus is taking a bad condition that somebody has, a suboptimal condition, and is cleansing them and is sort of healing them from that. And the ancients probably wouldn't have distinguished between an exorcism and a miraculous healing, because most of the time the two were connected to each other. I also want to take some time to geek out on one gospel in particular, so please bear with me on this one. The earliest of the 4 gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is the Gospel of Mark. This is second place in the canon, but it was written first in all probability. We'll talk about that later. But the cool thing is that Mark never actually refers to these evil spirits as demons. Mark's preferred term is unclean spirit. And that's actually really important because uncleanness in the ancient world wasn't necessarily a moral category. Cleanness and uncleanness were things that related to your ability to approach God. God was holy, and so anybody who approached him had to be holy. They had to be ritually clean. You could become unclean by doing a morally wrong thing. Murdering somebody made you unclean, but you could become more ritually unclean from other things as well. For instance, God is the God of life. He's the God of the living. And so if you come into contact with a corpse, that makes you ritually unclean until you cleanse yourself of that uncleanness. Likewise, if you get a bout of leprosy, you'll be ritually unclean until that comes, gets healed or goes away on its own, because again, that's a sign of death, whereas God is the God of life. So uncleanness affected someone's ability to approach God in the ancient Israelite philosophy, but it wasn't necessarily tied to moral factors, though sometimes it was. But a lot of times, some unfortunate people could be afflicted by uncleanness through powers beyond their control. A great example of this is from the Gospels themselves, where Jesus encounters many lepers and heals them. He also encounters a woman who has an issue of perpetual menstruation, which she's suffered with for a very long time. She's just been perpetually bleeding, and menstrual blood was known to render women ritually unclean. And so this woman had never been ritually clean in her life, and therefore couldn't approach the sanctuary of God at any point in her life. That's part of the key symbolism of that story. Likewise, as I said a second ago, death also renders a person as ritually impure. So take those four things into account, for instance. Take the idea of a leper being ritually impure. Take the idea of a woman with a bleeding issue being perpetually impure. Take the idea of somebody who's dead being perpetually impure as well. Tack onto that the fact that Mark calls demons impure spirits or unclean spirits. So the idea is that anybody who's afflicted by one of these spirits is likewise rendered ritually unclean as well. There's lots of other things that make somebody ritually unclean. It probably deserves its own video, but just keep these categories in your head for now. Now, most of the time, ritual uncleanness could be cross-contaminated from one person to another. If you touch a carcass, that renders you ritually unclean, and if anybody else touches you, they're now ritually unclean as well. So people who had these troubles, the lepers who were sick for years, the woman with a bleeding issue for her whole life, anybody who came into contact with those people would be rendered ritually unclean as well. And this led to a lot of these people being seen as sort of social pariahs because nobody wanted to risk ritual contamination. But the beautiful thing that the Gospel of Mark does is it shows that Jesus himself is ritually clean. Jesus himself is pure. And unlike anyone else in history or any other object in history, the cleanness of Jesus is contagious. Normally, if somebody were to touch an unclean person, they would be contaminated by the uncleanness. But Jesus, who is ritually pure, touches people and they're contaminated by his cleanness. It's a reverse contamination. And so in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus touches a leper and he's cleaned. Jesus should be rendered ritually unclean, but his touch cleanses the leper of his leprosy. And so cleanness radiates out from Jesus and contaminates the leper rather than the other way around. In the next story, Jesus touches the woman, or is touched by the woman, who has the issue of bleeding. And so just by touching the tassel of Jesus' clothes, she's contaminated by his cleanness. Jesus isn't rendered ritually unclean, she's rendered ritually clean. Jesus then immediately in the same story goes on into the house of Jairus, whose daughter has passed away, and he touches her hand. This should have rendered Jesus ritually unclean, but instead, because Jesus himself is ritually clean, the dead girl is contaminated by Jesus' ritual cleanness, and ritual cleanness is associated with life, and the girl comes back from the dead. So Jesus is just contaminating everybody with his ritual cleanness, associated with life, associated with the presence of God. And then he confronts people who are afflicted with unclean spirits, and Jesus casts the spirits out. So by casting the unclean spirits out, Jesus' cleanness, his ability to connect people with the presence of God, is what's being connected here. Yes, it's getting rid of something that's causing an affliction in this person's life, but more importantly, it's restoring connection to God that Jesus is really interested here with. So Mark seems to understand the banishing of unclean spirits as something sort of comparable to, healing physical maladies that likewise rendered somebody ritually unclean. It was Jesus' contact and his touch that's rendering these people ritually clean. So when we find Jesus encountering demons, when we find him encountering unclean spirits, what seems to be happening is that Jesus is repairing the relationship with humankind and God. He's destroying all of these unclean things, all of these things that render somebody ritually unclean, so that he can connect the people of earth really with God. Because to approach God, you need to be ritually clean, because God is the God of life. This would find its full conclusion in the sacrifice of Jesus, which renders everyone who believes in him ritually clean. We undergo baptism and so on and so forth. There's a lot of cool stuff going on there, but basically Jesus renders everybody who believes in him ritually clean so we can all have a relationship with the Father. And I think his exorcistic work sort of points to that. It may not be the only thing that's going on there, but it was too cool of a thing not to include. And you know what? That's how we're going to end this video. I want to end on something of a positive note. Demons are a complicated factor in the ancient world. There were a lot of different perspectives on them, and we don't get a whole lot of information on what they may or may not be from the Old Testament itself. There doesn't seem to be any text that requires us as Christians to hold to a complex demonology, but nevertheless, they do occasionally show up as sort of these forces of nature that can render people unclean. I guess I want to end this by saying that, demons were a factor in the ancient world, and we find them in the New Testament as well. But it was Jesus' actions by rendering these people who were ritually unclean by virtue of affliction by demons, and he was able to connect them to God using his own cleanness as a result from that. And that's kind of what Jesus came to do in the first place, was to restore the connection between humankind and God. And I think that's a great place to end the video on demons, because frankly, I'm getting kind of depressed about talking about evil all the time. If you watched any of the last video, you probably caught the fact that I was speaking pretty monotonously the whole time. That was for a couple of reasons. One, because it was just really heavy research that I was doing. Like, researching about the devil, geez, it's just depressing, right? And on top of that, I have a busy work schedule and recorded that like right after I got back from a work trip, so probably didn't do myself any favors there, but I wanted to get something out to you anyway. So I'm ending on a high note this time. I'm done talking about evil stuff. So this was video 2 of 4, or 4 plus, in the series that we're doing now. So we talked about Satan, and now we've talked about demons. And so next week's video is going to be on something related to these ones as well. I alluded to it earlier, or you can deduce it if you'd like. But that video is still on track. We're going to hopefully get to that one. And then video number 4 is really where the fun stuff is going to start. It's not going to be one video. I've had to split it into at least 4 so far, possibly more. They may not all be released like 1 week after the other. I might release a couple of them at one time, or maybe we'll do 1 or 2 and then take a break and then release more as research has time to go on, because Lord knows it takes forever to study these things. But we're on track. And so this is video 2 of 4. The depressing stuff is done with. Let's go on to the fun stuff now. If you like this video or any of the other videos on this channel, go ahead and leave a comment. I am looking for ideas on what to talk about next. I have a lot of ideas, but I want to know what you guys are interested in hearing about. So please do leave me some suggestions there. Please do like and subscribe if you would like to, but only if you believe that the video deserved it. That's the only compliment that I'm willing to take here. So thanks everybody for sticking along through this. Don't mess with demons, probably not a good idea, but I hope that this video was somewhat informative, and I'm really looking forward to what we have to talk about next. So take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all next time.